Part 1. The root you cannot see. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and every single debt you carry is gone, wiped clean, zero balance across the board. How does that feel? Now here is the question that matters far more than you think. How long before the debt comes back? Be honest with yourself right now. Because if you felt a small tightness in your chest when I asked that question, if something inside you whispered it would come back, then you already know. You already know that the problem was never really about the money. It was always about something deeper. You can cut a weed 100 times and watch it grow back by morning. That is the nature of a weed with a living root. You clear the debt and the debt returns. You solve the emergency and another emergency appears right behind it. You earn more and somehow, almost magically, you spend more, owe more, worry more. The numbers change, but the feeling never does. The cycle does not break because you have never broken the cycle at its source. A missed payment is a weed. A low balance is a weed. A lost opportunity is a weed. A broken agreement, a sudden setback, a door that closes just as you reach for it. These are all weeds. But here's what most people never stop long enough to understand. Beneath the surface, hidden below every visible symptom of financial lack, there is almost always a root, a belief, a fear, a single sentence, an inherited idea about money, about worth, about guilt, or about the moral meaning of struggle that has been running quietly in the background of your mind for years, sometimes for decades, shaping every financial decision you have ever made without you even knowing it was there. Emmett Fox taught something that changed the lives of thousands of people, and it can change yours today, if you are willing to hear it fully. He taught that the mind is a garden, not as a pretty metaphor, not as a comforting image for a greeting card, as a precise structural truth about how your life actually works. He taught that life grows precisely and inevitably from what is planted in the garden of your consciousness, every single time, without exception. And if you want a different harvest, if you are tired of pulling the same weeds year after year, then you must stop trimming symptoms. You must go deeper. You must find the root, and you must pull it out. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs to the person who has been managing financial emergencies for years. And if you are watching this right now, there is a very good chance you know exactly what I am talking about. It is not the exhaustion of idleness. It is not the tiredness of someone who has been sitting around waiting for life to hand them something. It is the exhaustion of constant motion that never produces a rival. You have worked hard, you have prayed, you have applied principles you learned from books and seminars and mentors. You have studied carefully and believed sincerely. You have climbed out of one hole only to find yourself standing at the edge of another one, looking down, thinking, how is this happening again? And at some point, the question is no longer whether you are doing enough. The question becomes whether something beneath the doing is quietly, persistently, systematically undoing everything you accomplish. That question deserves something more than another affirmation. It deserves more than another motivational push. It deserves a precise, structural, honest diagnosis of what is actually growing in the soil of your consciousness. Let me say something directly to you right now because I think you need to hear it. The pain of repeated scarcity is not only financial, it is psychological, it is spiritual, and it is deeply, painfully personal. It carries a specific kind of shame that is rarely spoken aloud, the shame of someone who knows the principles, who has read the books, who has sat in the seminars, who has written the affirmations on sticky notes and placed them on the bathroom mirror, and who still, after all of that, cannot explain why the outer conditions of their life refuse to match the inner work they have been doing. If that is you, I want you to know two things. First, that shame is itself a weed, and it has a root. Second, you are not broken. You are not uniquely disqualified from prosperity. You are not the one person on earth for whom the principles do not work. What has been happening is structural, not personal, and a structural problem has a structural solution. The root of the shame, the root of the recurring lack, the root of the pattern that keeps repeating no matter how hard you try to break it, is a set of beliefs about money, about worth, about receiving, and about the meaning of prosperity that were planted in the soil of your consciousness long before you ever encountered a spiritual teaching. Planted so early, so repeatedly, and so deeply that they no longer feel like beliefs at all. They feel like reality. They feel like facts. They feel like the way things simply are. And that, my friend, is precisely why they are so difficult to remove. Because you cannot question what you do not recognize as a belief. You cannot pull out a root you cannot see. The promise of what follows in this teaching is not that you will be given a new affirmation to paste on your mirror or a more optimistic outlook to carry into your week. The promise is structural. Emmett Fox spent his entire life teaching one central truth with more clarity and more precision than almost any spiritual teacher of his generation. He taught that the condition of a person's outer life is a precise and faithful report of the condition of their inner consciousness. Not a vague correlation, not a loose connection, a precise report. Change the consciousness and the conditions must change. That is not poetry. That is not wishful thinking. That is the operating principle behind every genuine and lasting transformation in the history of human experience. What you are about to receive across this teaching is the method, the actual practical step-by-step method by which Fox's principles of mental substitution, disciplined prayer, and the redirected attention of a trained mind can help you do something most prosperity teachings never actually equip you to do. Locate the specific root of poverty within your own garden of thought. Name it without shame. Withdraw the nourishment that has kept it alive and growing all these years, and implant in its place a truth that carries the authority of divine supply. Not a hope, not a wish, a truth with the weight of spiritual law behind it. Now, consider what this teaching actually is, because I want you to approach it with the right understanding from the very beginning. This is not a lecture about prosperity in the abstract. This is not a discussion about money mindset as a concept. This is a spiritual gardening process applied to the specific, personal, unique terrain of your mind. A gardener does not stand outside the garden and hope the weeds disappear. A gardener enters the garden. A gardener kneels in the soil. A gardener works with intelligence, patience, and the willingness to get their hands in the dirt. That is exactly what this teaching asks of you. Not passive reception, but active, honest, methodical engagement with the garden of your own mind. You will be asked to observe without judgment. You will be asked to name what you have been feeding, and you will be asked to make a single substitution so precise and so consistent that the old root loses its hold, and a new pattern takes its place. This is the work of consciousness, and it is, in my honest assessment, the highest practical work available to any human being. There is one more thing you should know before we go deeper, and this is important enough that I want you to really hear it. Within this teaching, there is a revelation that I have held specifically for Part 4. There is one poverty root that hides more successfully than any other. It hides because it does not look like a poverty root at all. It disguises itself as a virtue. It presents itself as humility. It presents itself as spiritual purity. It presents itself as the mark of a good person who does not love money too much, who keeps their priorities straight, who values the eternal over the temporal, and it is one of the most quietly destructive beliefs in the entire garden of poverty consciousness. We will name it, we will expose it, and we will remove it. But first, you must understand the full architecture of the garden, because that revelation will only carry its full transformative power once the foundation beneath it is completely clear. So here is where we begin. If this teaching is yours today, if you are prepared to do the real work of the genuine gardener rather than the endless, exhausting work of the symptom cutter who trims the weeds and watches them grow back every single time, then plant one act of commitment right now, in this moment. Write the words, "I remove the root," in the comments below. Not as a slogan, not as a reaction, as a declaration, as the first deliberate act of the gardener who has decided fully and finally that today the root work begins. Emmett Fox taught something that most spiritual seekers hear, nod along to, intellectually accept, and then rarely act upon with the precision the teaching actually demands. He taught that outer conditions do not have independent existence. They do not arise from a world that operates separately from the consciousness that observes and participates in it. They arise from within. The outer world, in Fox's framework, is a screen. It is the projection surface upon which the interior state of consciousness displays its content. What you see in your financial life, what you experience in the patterns of your income, your debt, your opportunities, and your limitations, is not the cause of anything. It is the effect. It is the faithful, impersonal, and utterly precise harvest of seeds that were planted in the soil of your consciousness, watered by your attention, warmed by your emotional energy, and grown by the undeviating law that governs all mental and spiritual cultivation. Let me make sure you catch the full weight of what that means. When you look at a financial problem, you are not looking at the problem. You are looking at the evidence of the problem. The condition is not the cause. The condition is the report. Think of it this way. A doctor does not treat a fever by applying ice to the forehead and declaring the illness resolved. A doctor investigates what is generating the fever at the level of the organism. The fever is the signal. The fever is the report. The illness is somewhere deeper. Fox applied exactly this kind of diagnostic intelligence to the life of the mind. When a person came to Fox in financial distress, he did not offer practical budgeting advice. He did not hand them a spreadsheet. He did not tell them to cut back on lattes and start a savings plan. He asked about the inner condition. He asked about what was being believed, what was being spoken, what was being feared and repeated and nourished with the energy of anxious attention. Because he understood, with the certainty of someone who had seen the law operate thousands of times, that the outer condition would persist precisely as long as the inner condition generating it remained intact. Change the inner condition, and the outer condition must change. Leave the inner condition untouched, and no amount of outer rearrangement will produce lasting change. The inner roots that sustain outer conditions of lack are not mysterious or hidden in any inaccessible way. They are simply beliefs that have been held long enough and reinforced often enough that they have descended below the level of conscious scrutiny. A belief that began as a single thought, perhaps a sentence spoken by a parent, perhaps a humiliation experienced in childhood around money, perhaps a religious teaching absorbed without examination. That single thought, through repetition and emotional reinforcement, becomes a settled conviction. And a settled conviction does not announce itself as a belief. It announces itself as the way things are. And that quiet, matter-of-fact self-presentation is its power. You cannot dispute what you cannot identify. You cannot remove what you cannot see. The first work of the gardener is not planting. It is not watering. It is not even clearing. The first work is the honest observation of what is already growing. Fox was specific about the mechanism behind all of this. He taught that the state of consciousness shapes experience because consciousness is not a passive observer of a pre-existing world. Consciousness is the operative power. It selects from the infinite field of divine possibility those conditions that correspond to its own internal pattern. This is not mysticism in the vague, hand-waving sense of that word. This is the precise operation of a law as impersonal and as exact as the law of gravity. Gravity does not choose which objects to pull downward. It operates on all objects without exception, without preference, and without moral judgment. The law of mental equivalence, as Fox understood it, operates the same way. It does not choose which beliefs to express as outer conditions. It expresses all of them, without exception, without preference, and without the slightest interest in whether those beliefs are serving you or destroying you. This is both the most sobering and the most liberating truth that Fox ever articulated. Sobering because it means that the conditions of your life are not accidental. They are not the result of an unkind universe that selected you for difficulty while others got the easy path. They are the precise expression of what your consciousness has been holding. Liberating for exactly the same reason. If the conditions of your life are the expression of your consciousness, then changing your consciousness changes your conditions. Not eventually, not approximately, not in some distant future when you have earned enough spiritual credit. With the same mathematical precision with which the current conditions express the current consciousness. The law has no loyalty to poverty. It has no preference for lack. It has no agenda. It is simply, always and only responding to the pattern it receives. And that means the work of prosperity is not primarily external. It is not primarily about strategy, effort, connections, or even opportunity. Though none of those things are without value, the primary work, the foundational work, the work without which all the external effort in the world will not produce lasting change, is the cultivation of a consciousness in which divine supply can find its corresponding mental equivalent. Fox was drawing here from the deepest tradition of metaphysical Christianity, the understanding that the kingdom, the realm of divine good, is within, not somewhere else, not in the future, not at the end of a long road of spiritual performance. Within, right now, already present, and the conditions of without are always the faithful reflection of what is within. To change without, you must first change within. And to change within, you must first know, precisely and honestly and without flinching, what is within. You must know what is growing in the garden. That is where we begin. And that is exactly where we are going next. Part 2. The Architecture of the Garden. The concept of mental equivalence is central to everything that follows in this teaching, so I want to make sure you understand it not just intellectually, but practically, because this is the engine that drives the entire system. This is the mechanism behind every financial pattern you have ever experienced, whether you knew it or not. Fox defined the mental equivalent as the interior image, the pattern, the belief that corresponds to and therefore draws its outer equivalent into manifestation. Let me put that in plain language. Whatever picture you hold inside your mind, whatever belief sits at the center of your consciousness, with enough emotional weight and enough consistency, that inner picture will find its way into your outer experience. Not because the universe is magical, because the universe operates by law. If you hold within your consciousness a clear, felt, emotionally alive sense of abundance, of right supply, of divine provision flowing toward you and through you, then you are holding the mental equivalent of abundance. And the law will express that equivalent in form. It has to. It has no choice. That is what law means. If you hold within your consciousness an anxious, chronic, emotionally charged conviction of lack, of scarcity, of struggle, of the impossibility of ease, then you are holding the mental equivalent of poverty. And the law will express that equivalent in form with exactly the same precision. The law makes no distinction between the two. It simply reads the pattern and expresses it. Every single time. Now here's where Fox went deeper than almost every other teacher of his era. And this is the part I really want you to catch. What distinguished his teaching from simple positive thinking was his insistence that the mental equivalent is not formed merely by what you consciously desire or consciously affirm. It is formed by the deeper, more persistent, more emotionally charged content of the consciousness. And those two things are often very, very different. You can affirm abundance in your morning practice. You can stand in front of the mirror and declare that you are a magnet for wealth and prosperity. And then you can spend the rest of the day, the remaining 16 or 17 waking hours, broadcasting the mental equivalent of lack through your automatic thoughts, your habitual speech, your emotional reactions to bills, your quiet dread when the phone rings and you suspect it is a creditor, and your deep, unexamined beliefs about what is actually possible for someone like you. When those two signals conflict, and they almost always do in the person who is struggling financially despite sincere spiritual practice, the deeper and more persistent signal wins. Not because the conscious desire is wrong, not because the affirmation is false, but because the root is stronger than the recently planted seed. The root has years of nourishment behind it. The new seed has days, maybe hours. This is the structural reason why affirmations alone, without root work, so rarely produce lasting transformation. And this is the diagnosis that most prosperity teachings never deliver with sufficient precision or sufficient honesty. The listener has been given seeds to plant. Good seeds, true seeds, seeds drawn from the highest spiritual authority. But the ground into which those seeds are being planted is still occupied by roots that are older, deeper, and far better fed than anything newly introduced. A garden that is simultaneously receiving new good seeds and maintaining old destructive roots is a garden in conflict. And in that conflict, the root wins. Not because evil has more power than good, not because the universe is stacked against you, but because the root has more nourishment, more history, and more emotional reinforcement behind it than the recently declared truth. The solution, and I want you to hear this clearly, is not more seeds. The solution is root removal, followed by consistent, disciplined cultivation of the replacement truth. One thing at a time, in the right order. Fox was absolutely unwavering on this point. He taught that you cannot serve two masters in the garden of the mind. You cannot hold simultaneously the mental equivalent of lack and the mental equivalent of supply and expect the supply to win simply because you prefer it. The mind does not work on the basis of preference. It does not care what you want. It works on the basis of what receives the most consistent nourishment. What you feed grows. What you starve dies. This is not a metaphor. This is the operating principle of mental cultivation as Fox understood and taught it across his entire body of work. From the Golden Key to the Sermon on the Mount, across hundreds of lectures delivered to thousands of people who came to him with exactly the problem you and I are addressing right now. And here is the mercy in Fox's system. The part that should give you genuine hope, not the shallow hope of wishful thinking, but the deep structural hope of someone who understands how a law works. No root is permanent. No root, however old, however deep, however long it has been nourished, has permanent authority over the soil of your consciousness, because your consciousness is not ultimately yours alone. It is an expression of the one mind. The divine intelligence that Fox taught permeates all of existence. That is the ultimate ground of all being. That divine intelligence does not sustain poverty. It does not uphold limitation. It does not protect the roots of lack from being removed. On the contrary, the entire movement of divine life, the entire direction and momentum of the infinite creative intelligence behind all existence, is in the direction of increase, expression, and the full flowering of good. The poverty roots in your mind are not natural. Let me say that again, because it matters more than you might initially realize. The poverty roots in your mind are not natural. They are invasive. They were planted by fear, by false teaching, by inherited belief, and by the emotional energy of repeated difficult experience. They do not belong to the soil of your consciousness, and the soil itself, when properly cultivated, when cleared of what does not belong, will reject them. This means your work is not to overcome a universe that is fundamentally indifferent or hostile to your prosperity. Your work is to cooperate with a divine principle that is fundamentally, permanently, and always oriented toward your good. The poverty roots are the obstruction to that good. Not the universe, not your past, not your circumstances, not some cosmic judgment upon your worthiness. The roots are the obstruction. Remove the roots and the good that was always available, always present, always waiting, flows into the space they occupied. This is the promise of Fox's teaching, and it is not a vague spiritual hope. It is a principle with the reliability of natural law applied with the precision of a trained mind. Now, with that foundation in place, I want to walk you through the garden model in detail, because every element of a living garden corresponds to a precise element in the operation of your mind. And understanding these correspondences is not a poetic exercise. It is practical preparation for the transformation work that is coming. The seeds of the garden are thoughts, but not all thoughts carry equal weight in the operation of mental law. This is a crucial distinction. A thought entertained once and then released, a passing idea that drifts through your mind and keeps moving, carries minimal force. It is like a seed blown across the surface of the ground by the wind. It touches the soil, but it does not enter it. But a thought returned to repeatedly, spoken aloud consistently, dwelt upon with emotional energy, and treated as a statement of permanent fact, that thought carries enormous force. Fox taught that it is the thoughts you dwell in, the thoughts that occupy the center of your attention with regularity and with the full weight of your conviction behind them, that become the seeds with real operative power. Think about it this way. A single seed dropped casually onto dry ground on a cold afternoon will not produce a harvest. But a seed planted consistently in season, with regular attention and appropriate care, will produce a harvest as inevitable as the turning of the year. The question is never which seeds you planted once during a moment of inspiration. The question is which seeds you have been planting consistently, persistently, day after day, with the full weight of your emotional conviction behind them. That is what the garden is growing. That is what the harvest will reflect. The soil of the garden is the subconscious atmosphere of the mind. Fox, drawing on the deep tradition of mental science, understood the subconscious not as a dormant storage unit where old memories collect dust, but as an active, responsive, and generative medium. The subconscious does not evaluate the seeds it receives. It does not distinguish between a thought of abundance and a thought of lack, and choose to nurture only the good one. That is not its function. It receives what is given to it, and it grows what it receives. With the indifference of fertile earth that will grow a rose or a thistle with equal generosity, depending entirely on what seed has been placed within it. The atmosphere of the subconscious, its general orientation toward the world, its settled expectations and emotional defaults, is the soil quality. And this matters enormously for practical purposes. Rich soil, a subconscious saturated with a long history of expectation of good, grows good quickly. New positive seeds take root fast in that kind of ground. But depleted soil, a subconscious compacted by years of fear, limitation, and anxious expectation, requires more deliberate cultivation before new seeds take full hold. This does not mean transformation is impossible in depleted soil. It means the gardener must be more patient, more consistent, and more deliberate. The soil can be restored, but it takes sustained work, not a single afternoon of inspired intention. The water of the garden is attention, and this, my friend, is perhaps the most operationally important element of the entire model, because attention is the one resource over which a trained practitioner of Fox's principles has direct, voluntary, moment-by-moment control. What you give your attention to, you water. What you water, you grow. It really is that straightforward. When you return repeatedly to the story of your financial problems, when you rehearse the details of your lack in conversation with friends or family, When you recalculate the deficit for the fifth time in a single afternoon, when you lie in bed at night retracing the narrative of how hard things have been and how little has changed, you are watering a plant. Not symbolically, not in some abstract spiritual sense. You are applying the most potent nourishing force in your psychological arsenal, the force of sustained, focused attention to the very root you most want to remove. And the root responds to that nourishment the way any plant responds to water. It deepens, it spreads, it becomes more firmly established in the soil. Every single time you give it your attention, it grows a little stronger. Withdrawing attention is not denial. I want to be very clear about this because it trips people up. Withdrawing attention from the poverty root does not mean pretending your financial situation does not exist. It does not mean ignoring bills or refusing to look at your bank account. It is the deliberate act of the gardener who recognizes that a plant deprived of water does not argue, it does not fight back, it simply declines, it weakens, it loses its hold on the soil, and eventually, inevitably, it dies. That is what happens to a poverty root when you stop watering it with your attention. Not overnight, but with the same certainty with which a plant without water always declines. The sunlight of the garden is emotion. If attention is the water, emotion is the sunlight. The force that drives the chemistry of growth, that accelerates the development of what is planted beyond what attention alone could accomplish. A thought held with strong emotion, whether that emotion is fear, excitement, conviction, or passionate longing, grows with a speed and a depth that a neutral thought simply cannot match. And this is why poverty thinking that is emotionally charged is so much more generative of poverty conditions than the occasional calm recitation of an abundance affirmation. Think about it honestly. When you check your account balance and the number is low, what happens in your body? There is a sick feeling, a tightening, a wave of dread that is not just intellectual but physical, visceral, hot. That emotional response is sunlight, intense, focused, burning sunlight applied directly to the poverty root. It supercharges the growth of the very thing you are trying to eliminate. And then the next morning, you sit down for your 5-minute affirmation practice, and you calmly, quietly, without much genuine feeling behind it, recite, "I am abundant. Money flows to me easily." That affirmation, recited in the morning without genuine felt conviction, is a seed planted in the dark. It has no sunlight. It has no warmth. It sits in the soil as a potential, but it does not grow. Not because the words are wrong, because the emotional energy behind them is not sufficient to germinate them. Fox understood this completely, and it is why he insisted, in teaching after teaching, that genuine prayer, genuine treatment, genuine spiritual work is not the repetition of words. It is the achievement of a felt inner state that carries the qualities of the reality being claimed. You must feel the truth of the counterstatement, even briefly, even imperfectly. You must feel it. The warmth of genuine inner conviction is the sunlight the new seed needs to take root and grow. The harvest of the garden is experience, and the harvest is always, without exception, honest. The garden does not lie. It does not produce roses when you have been planting thistles, no matter how sincerely you wanted roses. It does not produce abundance when you have been nourishing the mental equivalent of lack, no matter how genuinely you believed you were doing the right work. The harvest is the most precise and most faithful diagnostic instrument available to the practitioner. Here is what I want you to do with that understanding. Look at the harvest of your financial life without shame and without defensiveness. Just look at it and recognize that what you are looking at is a report, not a condemnation, not a verdict on your worth as a human being, a report. The report of a law that has been operating with perfect consistency. And here is the extraordinary thing about a law that has been operating against you with perfect consistency. When you understand it, when you learn to cooperate with it instead of unknowingly working against it, it can operate for you with the same perfect consistency. The harvest will change when, and only when, the garden changes. But the garden can change. That is the whole point. There is one more element of the garden model that Fox introduced that must be clearly understood before the practical work begins. The garden is not a closed system. It is not operating in isolation from a larger field. Fox consistently taught that the ground of all existence is a divine intelligence that is infinitely productive, infinitely generous, and fundamentally oriented toward the increase and expression of good. The natural state of the garden, its deepest nature, its essential orientation when the invasive roots of false belief have been cleared, is abundance. Let me say that differently so it really lands. The default setting of your consciousness, the way your mind was designed to operate before fear and false belief got in the way, is abundance, not scarcity, not struggle, not the grinding limitation of a life forever managing emergencies. Abundance, rich, varied, surprising, deeply satisfying good. The poverty root is not natural to your garden. It is an invasive species. It was introduced by fear, by human limitation, by the accumulated weight of difficult experience, and it has been maintained day after day, year after year, by the terrible habit of watering it daily with anxious attention. This carries enormous practical consequences. If the natural state of the garden is abundance, then abundance does not need to be created from nothing. It does not need to be summoned from a distant, indifferent universe. It is the default condition of a consciousness that is aligned with its own divine ground. What needs to be done is not creation, but clearing, not the heroic manufacture of a new reality from scratch, but the deliberate removal of what is blocking the good that is already the natural state of your rightly cultivated mind. The work is not addition, it is subtraction. Remove the root, and the abundance that was always the garden's natural expression has room to grow. This one insight, if you truly receive it, restructures everything about how prosperity work must be approached. Fox drew on the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount to make this precise point. He analyzed the directive to seek first the kingdom as exactly this instruction. Make the primary work the inner alignment with divine principle rather than the outer management of conditions. He showed that seeking the kingdom first is not a religious obligation to be discharged before the real work of living begins. It is the most practically efficient strategy available to any human being who wants lasting outer change. Because the kingdom, the domain of divine order and divine supply, is the only soil in which genuine and permanent prosperity can grow. Anything planted outside that alignment, any prosperity built on the foundation of unresolved poverty roots, will be unstable. It will not last. The weed will return. The money will disappear. The opportunity will collapse. But prosperity rooted in a genuinely transformed consciousness, a consciousness that has cleared its poverty roots and aligned itself with divine supply, that prosperity has the stability of something grown in its proper soil. It has deep roots of its own. It endures. The logic of the garden model follows with what Fox himself would have called mathematical certainty. The outer harvest is the effect. The inner garden is the cause. The condition of the inner garden is determined by what has been planted, by what has been watered, and by what emotional sunlight has been consistently applied. To change the harvest, you must change the garden. To change the garden, you must first identify what is actually growing in it, particularly the deep-rooted plants that have been there so long they feel like permanent fixtures of the landscape. Then you must withdraw the water of your attention from those roots. Then you must apply the sunlight of genuine, felt conviction to the new seeds of divine truth. And then you must be patient and consistent, not with the anxious waiting of someone hoping for a miracle that may or may not come, but with the calm confidence of a gardener who knows the law and trusts it completely. The garden is ready. The law is reliable. The soil is capable of growing something entirely new. The only question remaining is whether the gardener is ready to begin the real work. And if you are still here, if you have stayed with this teaching to this point, then I believe the answer is yes. Part 3. The Gardener's Method. Preparation and Root Removal. Before the practical work of root removal begins, there is a preparation of the mind that is not optional. It is not a warm-up exercise you can skip if you are eager to get to the good part. It is structural. It is the difference between a gardener who kneels in the soil with clear eyes and steady hands and one who enters the garden in a state of distress, pulling randomly, breaking stems, and confusing weeds with seedlings. The required state for this work has 3 words at its center, and each one of them carries weight. Honest observation without shame. Let me take those apart for you, because each one represents a specific discipline that must be established before anything deeper can be effective. Honest observation means the willingness to look at the actual condition of the garden without editing what you see. And I want to acknowledge something here, because I think it matters. Most people who have been practicing spiritual principles for years have developed a subtle habit that looks like spiritual maturity, but actually functions as a kind of self-protection. They know that negative thinking is harmful. They have been taught correctly that dwelling on negative conditions feeds those conditions. And so they have learned to quickly override negative thoughts, to reach for the affirmation, to redirect their attention toward the positive before the negative thought has been fully examined. That practice has real value in the moment-to-moment management of what Fox called the mental diet. But it becomes an obstacle, a serious one, when what is needed is not the suppression of a poverty thought, but the precise identification of its root. You cannot remove a root you have trained yourself not to look at. The honest observation required for this work means a temporary suspension of the reflex to quickly replace, and a willingness to ask a set of questions you may have been avoiding for a long time. Where does this thought come from? What does it actually say when I let it speak without interruption? How long has it been saying it? And what has it been producing in my life? This observation must be genuinely honest which means it must extend to the thoughts and beliefs that are most uncomfortable to examine. The comfortable poverty beliefs are the ones you already know about. You have probably named them before. They are familiar. The uncomfortable ones, the ones that actually hold the power, are the ones that have been operating so quietly and for so long that they feel less like beliefs and more like accurate assessments of reality. The belief that you always fall short by just a little. The belief that things always seem to work out for other people, but somehow never quite for you. The belief that when something good happens, something bad will follow to balance it. The belief that people of your background, your education, your particular set of circumstances do not simply prosper without enormous struggle. These beliefs do not present themselves as beliefs. They present themselves as experience-based observations. But they are seeds. They have been planted, they have been watered, and they are growing a harvest that matches their content exactly. The second element of the required state is the absence of shame. And I want to speak directly to this because for this audience, for people who have spent years in sincere spiritual practice and still face the recurring patterns of lack, the temptation to feel shame about those patterns is powerful, and it is destructive. Shame closes the observing eye. Shame says that what you are looking at is proof of your inadequacy, proof of your weak faith, proof of your insufficient commitment to the principles you profess to believe. And because that verdict feels unbearable, the mind protected by shame refuses to look clearly. It glances and looks away. It performs the observation without actually completing it. It goes through the motions of self-examination without ever arriving at the root, because arriving at the root would mean admitting that the root has been there all along, producing its harvest while you told yourself and others that you were doing the work. Emmett Fox would have said, and I believe he would have said it gently but without any hesitation, that shame is itself a weed. It is rooted in the false belief that your value as a spiritual being is measured by the current state of your outer conditions. It is not. Your current conditions are the report of a law in operation. They are not the verdict of a divine intelligence that has weighed your worth and found you lacking. The gardener's attitude toward weeds is neither shame nor distress. It is pragmatic, compassionate, and purposeful clarity. Think about a master gardener who walks into a section of the garden and discovers that it has been completely overtaken by deep-rooted invasive plants. Does the gardener sit down in the soil and weep? Does the gardener feel ashamed that such plants were ever permitted to establish themselves? No. The gardener simply kneels, identifies the root, grasps it firmly, and removes it with the steady confidence of someone who knows the work and knows it can be done. That is precisely the attitude with which you are asked to approach the poverty beliefs that will be identified in the steps that follow. They are weeds. They are not you. They are not permanent. They are not proof of anything except the operation of a law that has been applied without full understanding. And now that understanding is being given. It is also worth establishing here that this honest observation is a single, deliberate investigation, not a permanent preoccupation. Fox was clear in his teaching on the mental diet that prolonged dwelling on negative conditions, even for the purpose of analysis, is itself a form of watering the weed. The observation phase is surgical and specific. You enter the garden with the lantern. You look at what is growing. You name it precisely. And then you withdraw. You do not set up residence in the section of the garden where the poverty roots live. You visit it once with clear purpose and complete honesty, and then you redirect your full attention to the work of removal and replanting. The observation is the preparation for the action. It is not itself a spiritual practice to be maintained indefinitely. There is a practical method for preparing this observational state that is fully consistent with Fox's approach. Before undertaking the examination, spend several minutes in what Fox called the practice of the presence, the deliberate turning of attention from the outer world and its problems to the awareness of divine intelligence as the immediate, present operating reality of your own mind. This is not prayer as petition. It is not asking God to fix the garden for you. It is the deliberate establishment of a perspective from which the garden can be seen clearly without the distortion of fear or the defensiveness of shame. When you enter the examination from within the awareness of divine presence, the poverty roots lose their power to frighten you. They are simply what they are, old patterns, operating by a law you now understand. And the divine intelligence within you is more than sufficient to the task of removing them. Now, the method itself. 5 steps, each one building on the one before it. The sequence matters. Do not skip ahead. Step 1. Identify the recurring weed. This means moving your attention from the specific financial crisis of the present moment, which is only the most recent blossom of a plant that has been growing for a long time, and asking a larger diagnostic question. What is the pattern? Not what is the problem right now, but what is the shape of the problem that keeps returning? Because the recurring pattern is the footprint of the root. The root does not produce one weed and then stop. It produces the same category of weed in the same part of the garden with the same stubborn regularity until it is removed. The categories are recognizable. Some people live in a pattern of debt that clears and then rebuilds. The cycle is not poverty exactly, but a perpetual state of financial exposure, of always being one setback away from crisis. Others live in a pattern of undercharging, of consistently offering their work for less than it is worth, of finding it genuinely uncomfortable to name a higher price. Others live in a pattern of fear around receiving. Gifts are uncomfortable. Unexpected income produces anxiety rather than gratitude. Others cycle through emergencies. Every time stability begins to appear, something arrives to consume whatever has been saved. And others carry a deep, chronic guilt around money itself, a sense that wanting more is somehow wrong. You will recognize your pattern. It has been consistent, it has been specific, and it has probably been operating for so long that you have built stories around it, explanations that locate the cause in circumstances, in timing, in the behavior of others, or in forces outside your control. Set those stories aside. The story is not the diagnosis. The story is the weed describing itself. You need the root. Step 2. Locate the root sentence. The root sentence is the belief that has been sustaining the recurring weed. It is usually brief. It is usually old. And it often sounds like common sense, like practical wisdom derived from hard experience, rather than like the destructive spiritual error it actually is. Common root sentences include, money is hard to come by. people like me don't really prosper. I must struggle to be worthy of what I have. If I have more, others will have less. Rich people are not good people. Money causes conflict and corruption. God rewards the humble, and poverty is humility. I am not good with money. Every time I get ahead, something takes it back. These are not merely thoughts. They are operating commands. They are the standing instructions that the garden of your consciousness has been receiving and faithfully executing every single day, for as long as they have been the root sentence. Finding yours requires the same honest, shame-free observation we established in the preparation phase. Sit quietly. Bring to mind the area of your recurring financial weed, and then ask, without anxiety, without the need for a specific answer to arrive quickly, what do I actually believe about this? Not what do I want to believe? Not what the teachings say I should believe? What do I actually, practically, at the level of my gut, believe about money, about my right to prosper, about what happens to people like me when they try to get ahead? The answer that arrives quietly, without fanfare, often with a small contraction of feeling in the chest or the stomach, is usually the root sentence. It does not arrive as a revelation. It arrives as something you have known for a very long time and have been careful not to look at directly. When it arrives, write it down. Write it exactly as you hear it in your own inner voice, not a cleaned-up version, the actual sentence, because a named belief has lost the first layer of its power over you. Step 3. Withdraw attention from the root. This is Fox's principle of the mental diet applied with surgical precision to the specific weed you have identified. You have been feeding this root unintentionally but consistently, through every conversation in which you rehearse the evidence for it, through every internal monologue that returned to the proof of your financial limitation, through every emotional reaction that confirmed the root sentence, through every moment in which you repeated the root sentence to yourself or others as a simple statement of fact. Withdrawing attention means the deliberate and total cessation of all of these feeding activities in relation to this specific belief. It does not mean pretending the current financial condition does not exist. It means refusing to use the current condition as proof of the root sentence. It means recognizing that the current condition is the old harvest and that it does not define the new garden. And it means when the mind automatically returns to the root sentence, as it will, exercising the discipline Fox called substitution, the immediate replacement of the poverty thought with a truth of higher authority. Step 4. Plant the divine counter-truth. This is not the choice of an arbitrary affirmation pulled from a list. It is the identification of a truth drawn from the highest spiritual authority available to you, a truth that directly contradicts the root sentence at the level of its deepest claim. The counter-truths that have proven most operative for poverty roots include, God is my supply, and my supply is perfect and immediate. Good comes to me through righteous channels that I cannot predict and need not fear. I can prosper fully and remain spiritually aligned, for my prosperity blesses rather than diminishes others. Divine intelligence manages my financial life with wisdom that exceeds my anxiety. I am worthy of good, not because I have earned it through suffering, but because God is the source of my worth and God's supply is limitless. The planting of the divine counter must be more than intellectual. This is the point at which Fox's insistence on the felt quality of genuine prayer becomes practically critical. You are not planting a sentence in your mind. You are planting a living seed in the soil of your consciousness. And for that seed to have operative power, it must be received not only intellectually, but emotionally and spiritually. The practice is to take the counter-truth and hold it in your awareness with the patience and the warm conviction of a gardener pressing a seed into rich, moist earth, not with desperation, not with the anxious intensity of someone trying to force a result, with the calm, grounded confidence of someone who understands the law and trusts the soil. Fox called this relaxed, confident, spiritually aligned inner state the condition of genuine prayer. It is the condition in which the new seed receives the sunlight it needs to take root. Step 5. The 7-day mental diet applied to money. For 7 consecutive days, you refuse to speak the old root sentence aloud. You refuse to repeat any version of it in internal monologue. You refuse to engage in conversations that rehearse the evidence of financial limitation without a conscious counter-truth being simultaneously held. This does not mean you cannot acknowledge practical financial realities. It means you refuse to narrate those realities in the language of the root sentence. You can look at the account balance without saying, "I never have enough." You can discuss a financial challenge without concluding, "This is just how it is for me." Every time the old sentence surfaces, and it will, with irritating persistence in the early days of the diet, you do not fight it. You do not argue with it. You substitute it. You replace it immediately and completely with the divine counter-truth you planted in step 4. Not once or twice when you remember. Every time, without exception, for 7 days. Fox taught that 7 days of an unbroken mental diet is sufficient to produce a measurable shift in the atmosphere of the subconscious. Not a complete transformation of years of deep conditioning in 1 week, but a genuine and detectable loosening of the root's grip. The soil begins to respond. The new seed begins to establish itself. And the gardener, who can feel that shift, however small, has the most important thing available to a human being engaged in this work: evidence. Evidence that the law is responding to the new pattern. Evidence that the garden is capable of change. Evidence that the harvest is not fixed. That evidence becomes the foundation of the sustained practice that produces full transformation. 7 days is not the end. It is the proof of principle. It is the first fruit of the new planting. And the first fruit, Fox would say, is the gift that sustains the gardener through the full season of cultivation. The sequence of these 5 steps has an internal logic that must not be violated by impatience. The temptation, especially for the experienced spiritual practitioner, is to skip the observation phases and go directly to the affirmation, because the affirmation feels more constructive and more consistent with what they has been taught about maintaining a positive mind. But an affirmation planted before the root is identified and before attention is withdrawn from it is like sowing good seeds in a garden where the weeds are still in full possession of the soil. The seeds may sprout, but the weeds will crowd them out. The sequence matters. Observe honestly. Name the root precisely. Withdraw the water of attention. Plant the counter-truth with felt conviction. Maintain the mental diet with complete consistency. This is not a sequence that can be reordered without losing its power. It is a disciplined, sequential process that respects the actual operating mechanism of the law it is applying. The garden, understood this way, is not a static system, but a dynamic one. Every day presents new choices about what receives your attention and your emotional energy. Every conversation is a gardening decision. Every internal monologue is an act of cultivation. Every moment of anxious rehearsal of the evidence of lack is water applied to the poverty root. And every moment of deliberate, felt, spiritually grounded alignment with the counter-truth is sunlight applied to the new divine seed. The cumulative weight of these daily choices, consistently made in the direction of truth rather than in the direction of habit, is what produces the transformation of the garden. It is never one dramatic act. It is the discipline of consistent cultivation applied by a mind that understands the law and has committed to working with it deliberately every single day, without the expectation of instantaneous results, but with the absolute confidence that the harvest will match the garden. Because it always does. Because the law is precise. And because it does not make exceptions. Part 4. The 3 fatal mistakes and the root that wears a mask. The promise that Fox made, and I want you to hear this as a promise made not by a preacher offering consolation, but by a teacher demonstrating law, is that the consciousness that goes through this process, that observes honestly, names the root specifically, withdraws attention completely, plants the counter-truth with genuine conviction, and maintains the mental diet consistently, will see the outer conditions begin to shift. Not because a miracle has been performed, but because a law has been applied correctly. Perhaps for the first time with full understanding of its mechanism. The garden that has been growing poverty will not grow poverty forever if the root is removed, the soil is cultivated, and the new seed is planted and nourished with consistency and faith. This is the law. This is the promise. And it stands. But here is where I need to be very honest with you, because there is a gap between knowing a principle and applying it correctly. And that gap is where most people who are sincere in their spiritual practice spend most of their lives. They know the principle, they apply it, and the results do not match the investment. When this happens for long enough, the practitioner begins to suspect one of 2 things. Either the principle does not work, or they are somehow uniquely disqualified from its benefits. Neither of those conclusions is accurate. The accurate conclusion, the one that actually opens the door to real change, is that a specific, identifiable, diagnostic error has been embedded in the practice, operating below the level of conscious awareness, consistently and reliably undermining the work. Emmett Fox spent much of his teaching career identifying these precise errors because he encountered them in person again and again in thousands of people who were sincere, educated in the principles, and still producing the same harvest of lack. What I am about to share with you are the 3 most common and most destructive of those errors. And if you recognize yourself in any of them, do not let shame close the door. Let recognition open it. The first fatal mistake is fighting the weed while simultaneously feeding the root. This is the most common error in all spiritual prosperity work, and it is the most difficult to identify from the inside because both activities feel like legitimate spiritual effort. Fighting the weed looks like strategic financial planning. It looks like seeking new income sources. It looks like addressing the external conditions of the lack with energy and effort. These activities are not wrong. They are not spiritually invalid. But when they are conducted while the inner poverty root is still receiving its daily ration of attention, emotion, and anxious rehearsal, they are ineffective at the level that matters. The outer effort cannot produce lasting change when the inner pattern is still generating the condition the outer effort is trying to eliminate. Think of it this way. Imagine you are trying to dry a room while the faucet that is flooding it remains wide open. The drying effort is real. The labor is genuine. You are mopping as hard as you can. But the cause of the flooding is being simultaneously addressed and ignored. And the flooding continues. That is what happens when you work hard on the outside while a poverty root on the inside is still being fed. The specific way in which the root gets fed while the weed is being fought is almost always unconscious. The practitioner wakes in the morning, affirms abundance, and then spends the rest of the day in a constant low-level internal broadcast of the root sentence. Every time the bank balance comes to mind, the root sentence plays. Every time a financial opportunity is evaluated, the root sentence filters the evaluation. Every conversation about money is unconsciously framed by the root sentence. Every dream about the future carries the emotional undertone of the root sentence as a background frequency that colors everything. None of these internal broadcasts feel like deliberate action. They feel like realistic thinking, like honest assessment, like the practical management of actual circumstances. But they are feeding the root, and the root is growing, and the harvest is repeating. Fox's teaching makes the implication inescapable. If you want to stop fighting the weed, you must stop feeding the root, not reduce the feeding. Stop it. This requires the honest observation and the radical mental diet described in Part 3, applied not as an occasional spiritual exercise, but as a non-negotiable daily discipline until the root loses its hold. The second fatal mistake is the confusion of poverty with spiritual purity. This one requires more delicate handling because it lives in territory where human spirituality and human psychology are deeply and sincerely intertwined. It is the belief, held sincerely and often invisibly, that financial struggle is evidence of holiness, that material scarcity is proof of proper priorities, that the person who does not prosper financially is thereby demonstrated to be more focused on the eternal than the temporal. This belief is ancient. It runs through certain strands of religious teaching with the persistence of a river through limestone. It has shaped the unconscious assumptions of millions of people whose spiritual formation included, in some form, the idea that money is dangerous to the soul, that the spiritual person should not want too much, that poverty is close to godliness, and that prosperity is the domain of the worldly and the spiritually compromised. Fox addressed this confusion directly and with an authority that drew on the deepest sources of the metaphysical Christian tradition. He taught that divine intelligence is not poverty-affirming. The universe that created the oceans, the forests, the mineral wealth of the earth, and the infinite generative capacity of the sun did not do so in order to produce spiritual beings who would demonstrate their alignment with it by having as little as possible. The teaching of Jesus, on which Fox based so much of his work, was not a teaching of approved scarcity. It was a teaching of the kingdom, the realm of divine order, in which good of every kind, material and spiritual, flows to those who are aligned with its principle. The practical consequence of this confusion is devastating. The person who secretly believes that poverty proves their goodness will unconsciously resist every genuine move toward prosperity. They will undercharge for their work, not because they lack confidence exactly, but because something in them believes that receiving full value is somehow spiritually suspect. They will feel uncomfortable in the company of financially successful people, not because they are envious, but because a part of them has concluded that prosperity and integrity cannot coexist. They will pray for financial improvement and simultaneously nourish a deep inner conviction that God approves of their struggle, which means that the prayer and the root sentence are at war within the same consciousness. And the prayer cannot win while the root sentence is being watered by sincere religious feeling. This is one of the most painful and most persistent forms of the poverty root, precisely because it is protected by the armor of genuine spiritual sincerity. The third fatal mistake is the scattering of new seeds without a concentration of sustained attention on any single one. This error arises from the combination of genuine enthusiasm and genuine desperation that characterizes the experienced spiritual seeker who has been trying to change their conditions for a long time. They encounter a new principle. They are moved by it. They begin planting it with real excitement and real conviction. But then they encounter another principle the following week and plant that seed too, and another the week after, and another. And soon the garden has received many different new seeds, each planted with initial enthusiasm, each receiving a few days of attention before the next one arrives, and none of them receiving the sustained, consistent, emotionally present nourishment required for the law to complete its work through them. Fox taught one counter-truth at a time, with a focused, almost fierce concentration. The mental diet is not a varied menu of many affirmations selected according to mood. It is the sustained, consistent, exclusive application of one operative truth until it has taken root deeply enough to produce visible evidence of its operation in the outer conditions of life. The temptation to plant many seeds simultaneously is the spiritual equivalent of the frantic gardener who plants the entire seed catalog in one afternoon and then cannot understand why nothing grew to maturity. One seed, consistently watered, consistently exposed to the sunlight of genuine conviction, consistently protected from the competing weeds of old poverty thinking. That one seed will grow. It will take root. It will produce a harvest. And the harvest of that one seed, once it arrives, provides the evidence and the confidence to plant the next seed with even greater precision and greater faith. This is the path. Concentration, not proliferation. Depth, not variety. Sustained attention to one operative truth until the law has expressed it in visible form. The pattern of these three mistakes reveals something important about the nature of genuine spiritual practice versus the performance of spiritual practice. Genuine practice requires the willingness to be honest about the gap between what you profess and what you internally broadcast. It requires the courage to examine the beliefs that are protected by religious sentiment and to ask whether they are genuinely of God or whether they are human constructions masquerading as divine sanction. And it requires the discipline to work with one truth at a time, to give the law room to operate, rather than flooding the garden with good intentions that are spread too thin to take root. Now, I told you at the beginning of this teaching that there was a revelation held for this moment, a poverty root that hides more successfully than any other, because it does not look like a poverty root at all. It presents itself as a virtue. It presents itself as the mark of a spiritually mature person who has correct priorities, who does not allow material concerns to dominate their inner life, who is not grasping, not greedy, not obsessed with money the way the worldly are obsessed with money. It wears the garments of humility, and it speaks the language of genuine spiritual commitment. And it is, in Emmett Fox's framework, one of the most consistently destructive roots in the entire garden of poverty consciousness. The time has come to name it. The hidden poverty root is this: the belief that wanting prosperity is selfish, unspiritual, or evidence of misaligned priorities. The belief, held often below the level of full conscious awareness, that a truly good person, a truly spiritual person, a person of genuine faith and genuine virtue, should not want very much in the way of material abundance. That contentment with little is the mark of the saint, that the desire for prosperity is the mark of the worldly, and that therefore, to the extent that you are sincere in your spiritual commitment, you must not want too much. You must not ask for too much. You must not receive too much without immediately feeling that some accounting is due, that something will be taken back to restore the balance. That prosperity enjoyed fully is prosperity enjoyed at someone else's expense, or at the expense of your own spiritual depth. This root is so effective at escaping examination precisely because the spiritual instincts it mimics are genuine and important. The spiritual tradition does consistently teach that greed is destructive, that the love of money as an end in itself corrodes the soul, that material wealth pursued without reference to higher purpose produces spiritual desolation. These are true teachings. They contain genuine wisdom, but they have been distorted in the consciousness of a great many sincere spiritual practitioners into the much broader and fundamentally false teaching that wanting prosperity itself is spiritually suspect, that the desire for financial ease is the beginning of greed, and that the safe spiritual position is to maintain a studied ambivalence about material increase. That distortion is the root, and it operates with devastating efficiency. Fox, drawing on his deep reading of the Sermon on the Mount and the teaching tradition of Mary Baker Eddy and the broader New Thought movement, was categorical on this point. He taught that divine supply is not greed. He taught that the good things of this world, including financial abundance, are expressions of divine good in useful, practical, material form. He taught that a person of spiritual alignment does not become less spiritual by prospering materially. On the contrary, the properly aligned consciousness expresses its alignment precisely through the harmonious operation of divine principle in every domain of life, including the financial. Poverty is not evidence of spiritual alignment in Fox's teaching. It is evidence of a mental equivalent of poverty being held in a consciousness that has not yet aligned itself with the fullness of divine supply. The practical consequences of this hidden root are almost perfectly mimetic with genuine spiritual virtue, which is what makes it so difficult to identify and so resistant to removal. The person carrying this root does not look like someone with a poverty problem. They look like someone with the spiritual success. They are generous. They undercharge, and they call it non-attachment. They reject financial offers, and they call it discernment. They feel guilty receiving, and they call it humility. They stay small financially, and they call it priorities. Every one of these outer behaviors is consistent with the appearance of a person who has placed spiritual values above material ones. But Fox would have looked beneath the outer behavior and asked the diagnostic question: is this a genuine expression of spiritual freedom? Or is it the behavioral expression of a belief that says prosperity and goodness cannot coexist in the same life? The removal of this particular root requires a specific counter-truth that addresses not the surface behavior, but the theological error beneath it. The operative truth that Fox's framework provides is this: divine supply is the expression of God's good in the world, and my prosperity, rightly held and rightly used, is a channel through which that good flows. Not a withdrawal from a fixed supply that diminishes others, but an expression of an infinite good that increases with every conscious alignment. To prosper is not to hoard. To receive is not to deprive. To be financially abundant in alignment with divine principle is to be a clear channel for the expression of good in the world, with more capacity to serve, more freedom to give, more practical power to be useful to the life around you. The person who remains financially contracted out of a confused sense of spiritual virtue is not more aligned with God's intention. They are simply more contracted, and the contraction serves neither them nor anyone around them. This is the hidden root. Name it if it is yours. You will recognize it not by a dramatic inner revelation, but by the small, quiet discomfort you feel when you are asked to charge what your work is fully worth. When you receive an unexpected financial gift without immediately planning to give it away. When you imagine yourself in a condition of genuine financial freedom and notice that the image is accompanied by a faint anxiety, a residual question about whether you would still be a good person in that condition. That anxiety is the root speaking. And now you know its name. And a root that has been named by a mind that understands the law has lost its first and most important layer of protection. The gardener has found it. The removal can begin. Part 5. The science behind the garden, the story within it, and the challenge that seals it. The understanding that the inner pattern of belief shapes the outer pattern of experience is not the exclusive property of spiritual philosophy. The same structural reality has been mapped with different vocabulary and different investigative tools by the disciplines of psychology and neuroscience. The convergence is not proof in the scientific sense of the metaphysical claims that Fox was making, but it is a parallel that the serious practitioner should understand, because it provides a different kind of confirmation. The confirmation that the mechanism Fox identified as spiritual law corresponds to what the careful study of the human mind has independently discovered about how human beings think, choose, and respond to their circumstances. The relevant concept from psychology is that of the core belief, or the cognitive schema. These are the deep, often unconscious, highly generalized beliefs about oneself, other people, and the world that are formed early in life, reinforced by experience, and that operate as filters through which all subsequent experience is processed and interpreted. They do not present themselves as interpretations. They present themselves as accurate perceptions. A person carrying a core belief of the form, "I am not fundamentally worthy of good things," does not experience this as a belief they are choosing to apply to their experience. They experience it as a straightforwardly accurate description of how things are. And because all incoming experience is filtered through this belief, evidence that confirms it is readily absorbed and amplified, while evidence that contradicts it is systematically minimized, distorted, or dismissed. The belief protects itself by shaping the very perception that would otherwise challenge it. This mechanism of self-confirming belief is what makes the poverty root so persistent in the life of a person who has genuinely been trying to change. It is not that the attempts at change have been insincere. It is not that the principles applied have been wrong. It is that the core belief has been filtering the results of those attempts through its own lens. When a small financial improvement occurs, the core poverty belief interprets it as temporary, as the precursor to the inevitable reversal, as luck rather than law. The improvement does not update the belief, because the belief has processed the improvement in a way that is consistent with its own content. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is the entirely predictable operation of a deeply established cognitive pattern. And it is precisely what Emmett Fox was describing in the language of spiritual mechanism when he taught that the mental equivalent is not overridden by occasional good results, but requires a genuine and sustained transformation of the inner pattern. The concept of cognitive schemas also illuminates the mechanism by which repeated beliefs about money shape choices, emotional responses, and what opportunities feel safe to accept. A person whose deep schema around money says, "Financial comfort is not for people like me," will encounter specific financial opportunities and experience them as threatening rather than promising. Not because the opportunities are objectively threatening, but because the schema filters them through the lens of its own content and generates the emotional signal of anxiety, suspicion, or unworthiness that then drives the behavioral response of avoidance or self-sabotage. The opportunity is real. The emotional signal generated by the schema is real. But the emotional signal is being generated by the schema, not by an accurate assessment of the opportunity. And the behavioral response that follows from that emotional signal, the hesitation, the rejection, the subtle self-undermining that keeps the opportunity from being fully claimed, produces the very evidence that the schema then uses to confirm itself. The cycle is closed. The garden grows what was already there. This psychological parallel is valuable to the spiritual practitioner, not because it replaces the spiritual framework, but because it deepens the understanding of why the spiritual work must be applied at the level of the root, rather than at the level of the surface condition. Cognitive behavioral psychology has demonstrated across decades of research that surface-level behavioral change, changing what you do, without changing the underlying belief that is driving the behavior, produces incomplete and temporary results. the behavior changes, the underlying schema remains, and the schema eventually reasserts its influence, pulling the behavior back toward the pattern it was generating in the first place. This is identical to the gardening observation that cutting the weed without removing the root produces a weed that returns. The mechanism is the same, whether you call it a cognitive schema or a poverty root. The required intervention is the same. You must go to the root, not the symptom. What spiritual practice offers that psychology does not, at least not in its standard clinical form, is a source of counter-truth that carries a weight greater than human opinion or therapeutic reframing. When Fox instructed his students to replace a poverty thought with a spiritual truth drawn from the recognition of divine supply, he was not offering a cognitive reframe in a clinical sense. He was offering a truth claim with ontological weight. The claim that divine intelligence is the actual and ultimate ground of supply, that this supply is not subject to the limitations that the human mind imposes on it, and that the consciousness that aligns itself with this truth is aligning itself with something more real and more permanent than any negative belief formed in the fearful experiences of ordinary human life. The operative power of the counter-truth in Fox's system comes from its source, not merely from its content. It is not a more positive story. It is a more accurate account of what actually is. Both frameworks, the psychological and the spiritual, agree completely on the time frame required for genuine transformation. Psychologists working with deeply embedded cognitive schemas have consistently found that transformation requires sustained, repeated, emotionally engaged exposure to new information that contradicts the schema over a sufficient period of time, until the new pattern has sufficient history and sufficient emotional weight to compete with the old one. This is not quick change. It is the kind of consistent, patient, disciplined cultivation that Fox was prescribing when he insisted on the 7-day mental diet. Not as a one-time experiment, but as the beginning of a sustained practice. The garden changes over the season, not over the afternoon, but a garden that is consistently and correctly cultivated will change. The law guarantees it. Now let me share something with you that brings all of this together in a way that I think will stay with you long after this teaching ends. Consider the story of a woman who had spent many years in sincere and serious spiritual practice. She had read widely in the New Thought tradition. She had studied Fox's teaching on the mental diet and had practiced it faithfully. She prayed with genuine conviction. She held the inner states that Fox described as the conditions for effective prayer, and yet her financial life remained contracted, not catastrophically impoverished, but perpetually small. Small income, small prices charged for her work, small receipts when larger ones seemed both deserved and possible. She was a teacher, a healer in the broad sense, someone who gave enormous value through her work, and she consistently charged less for that work than anyone who knew it would have said it warranted. She consistently deflected financial compliments. She consistently felt something close to guilt when she received an unexpected financial gift. She described herself privately as someone who was simply not very interested in money, and she believed this description to be evidence of her spiritual maturity. The diagnostic moment came not in prayer, but in an honest conversation with herself that she had been avoiding for a long time. When she applied Fox's process of identifying the root sentence, when she sat with the honest question of what she actually believed about prosperity and her right to it, what arose was not the comfortable spiritual aphorism she had been publicly claiming. What arose was a sentence she recognized immediately as something she had heard many times in her religious upbringing and had absorbed as moral law. Wanting more than you need is greed, and greed is the corruption of the soul. She had been carrying this sentence as a permanent background frequency for decades. It had shaped every financial decision she had ever made. It had been the filter through which every financial opportunity had been processed. And because it presented itself as a virtue, as a guard against the spiritual danger of greed, she had never subjected it to the examination it deserved. What she discovered when she held it up to the light of Fox's teaching was that the sentence was not a spiritual truth. It was a distorted remnant of a genuine spiritual teaching, distorted beyond the point of usefulness into a belief that was actively preventing the expression of divine good through her life. She was not being protected from greed by this belief. She was being kept from the full expression of her capacity to serve, to give, to contribute, and to prosper in ways that would have blessed not only herself, but everyone she worked with. The poverty root was wearing the mask of spiritual virtue, and once she saw the mask clearly, she could see the root beneath it. She replaced the root sentence with one that Fox's framework provided with precision. God's good can flow through me fully and bless others as it does. This was not an affirmation of greed, it was an affirmation of channel. The recognition that she was not a reservoir with a fixed supply that diminished as she received, but a channel through which divine good could flow, increased by alignment rather than depleted by use. She held this counter-truth with the patient warmth Fox described. She applied it consistently every time the old sentence attempted to return. She maintained the mental diet around money with a discipline she had previously applied only to other areas of spiritual practice, and the results followed the law. The first thing that changed was not her income. The first thing that changed was her ease. She noticed that the low-level anxiety that had surrounded all financial matters began to lift. She noticed that she could think about money without the faint nausea of guilt that had accompanied such thinking for as long as she could remember. She noticed that when a client expressed deep gratitude for her work and offered a payment that properly reflected its value, she could receive that payment without the familiar reflex of deflection. These were inner changes, small ones, but they were evidence of root removal. The soil had changed, and as the soil changed, the outer conditions followed. Her practice grew. She raised her prices without the inner war she had always anticipated. She received financial gifts with genuine gratitude rather than guilty discomfort. The channel had been cleared. The flow that followed was not a miracle. It was the law responding to an aligned consciousness with the same fidelity with which it had always responded to an unaligned one. This story is not the story of one woman. It is the story that repeats with individual variations across the lives of thousands of sincere spiritual practitioners who carry the hidden poverty root. The details differ. The root sentence takes different forms depending on the religious background, the family history, and the particular emotional texture of the individual experience. But the structural pattern is identical, and the resolution is always the same. Now, Before we reach the final challenge, I want to give you something practical, something you can use immediately. The contrast between a poverty root and its divine counter is not a contrast between pessimism and optimism. It is a contrast between two different operative commands issued to the same law, producing two different corresponding harvests with the same mechanical precision. Understanding these pairs makes the substitution process concrete and actionable. Consider the root sentence, "I must struggle to be worthy." The divine counter that directly addresses it is, "I am worthy because God lives in me." This is the shift from conditional to unconditional worthiness, from earned to given, from the logic of struggle as proof to the logic of divine identity. Consider the root sentence, "Money is unsafe." The divine counter is, "Divine intelligence governs my increase." This shifts the operative command from human fear managing a dangerous resource to divine principle managing an expression of unlimited good. Every poverty root expresses some version of the belief that the good available to you is limited, conditional, unsafe, or spiritually suspect. Every divine counter-truth expresses some version of the recognition that divine supply is unlimited, unconditional, safe, and the natural expression of a consciousness aligned with its own infinite source. The substitution from root to counter-truth is not the substitution of one human opinion for another. It is the substitution of a human error for a divine fact. Know your root sentence specifically. Know its divine counter-truth specifically. And plant the counter-truth in the exact location vacated by the root with precision, patience, and the warm conviction of the gardener who trusts the soil, trusts the seed, and trusts the law. The synthesis of everything that has been taught across this entire teaching converges now on a single point of operational clarity. Prosperity is not primarily the addition of new positive thoughts to a consciousness that remains otherwise unchanged. The primary work is the removal of what blocks the good that is the natural state of the rightly aligned mind. You are not building prosperity from nothing. You are removing the obstruction to a prosperity that is your natural inheritance as an expression of divine intelligence. The good was never withheld. The supply was never absent. The channel was never closed by the universe. It was blocked by beliefs, by sentences, by inherited errors, by the emotional residue of past financial trauma, and by the sincere but misguided conviction that struggle is holy. Remove these blockages, and the good that was always available flows, not because a miracle has been performed, but because a law has finally been cooperated with correctly. The work is not addition, it is subtraction, and the law has no loyalty to the past and no interest in punishing the historical errors of an unexamined consciousness. It simply reads what is currently in the garden and expresses it. Change the garden today, and the law changes its expression today. Not after a probationary period, not after some cosmic accounting has been settled, today. Your mind is not barren. Let that statement land in you with the weight it carries. A barren mind is not possible. A mind that is alive is a mind that is growing something always without pause. The question was never whether the garden was producing. The question was what it was producing and why. And now you know. You know the mechanism. You know the names of the roots. You know the law by which the harvest is determined. And that knowledge, received and held in the consciousness of a mind that is now prepared to act on it, is the most powerful single change in your inner condition that this teaching can produce. Change what you plant, and you change what grows. Change what you water, and you change what thrives. Change what you receive in emotion, and you change the speed of the harvest. Every conversation about money from this day forward is a gardening decision. Every internal monologue is an act of cultivation. Every return to the old poverty sentence is an act of watering the root you have committed to removing. And every moment of deliberate, grounded, spiritually present alignment with a counter-truth is a moment of genuine cultivation. The cumulative weight of these moments, one by one, day by day, is the real work of transformation. The challenge that closes this teaching is not a suggestion. It is an invitation into the practice itself. It is called the Poverty Root Challenge, and it is conducted over 7 days. On the first day, take a single sheet of paper. Write down the recurring financial weed in your life, the pattern that returns, the specific shape of the limitation that has been consistent. Do not explain it or justify it. Name it simply and clearly. Beneath it, write the root sentence that you discover when you ask honestly and without shame what you actually believe about money, about your right to prosper, and about what is possible for someone with your history and your particular inner landscape. Write the root sentence exactly as it sounds in your own inner voice, not a cleaned-up version, the actual sentence. On the second day, write the divine counter-truth, one sentence drawn from the highest spiritual authority available to you, a sentence that directly and precisely contradicts the root sentence at the level of its deepest claim. You do not need to believe this sentence fully on the second day. You need to write it with the willingness to believe it. The full conviction follows from the practice, not the other way around. On each of the remaining 5 days, maintain the mental diet. Every time the root sentence surfaces in thought, in speech, in the emotional reaction to a financial reality, substitute it immediately with the counter-truth, not eventually, immediately, and hold the counter-truth for the few seconds required to introduce the quality of genuine felt warmth into it, even briefly. The 7 days are not the end of the work. They are the beginning of the evidence. By the 7th day, the garden will have shifted. Not completely, not permanently, not yet, but detectably. And the detectable shift is the practitioner's most powerful confirmation that the law responds and that the work is real. If you have recognized something in this teaching that you have been living, that you have been practicing around, that you have been searching for the exact name of, then commit to this work. Not for a channel, not for a video, for the garden, because the next teaching builds on this one, and the practitioner who receives them in sequence does not merely accumulate knowledge. They cultivate a consciousness, and a cultivated consciousness in the precise and unwavering teaching of Emmett Fox is the only instrument capable of producing a genuinely different harvest. Before you leave this space, there is one action that will seal the understanding of this teaching more permanently than any notes you could take or any resolution you could make. Think of one specific moment in your own life, not a general pattern, but one specific moment where this law was already operating, where a poverty root was quietly shaping a choice, a response, a rejection, a contraction, an unexplained inner resistance to something good that was being offered to you. It may have been a moment you barely noticed at the time, a moment that seemed unremarkable, a moment that only reveals its significance now that you have the diagnostic language to read it clearly. Write that moment in the comments below, not as a confession, not as a testimony of failure, as an act of recognition, as the completion of a circuit. Because the mind that can identify the law in the past has acquired in that very act of identification the capacity to operate the law in the future. Recognition is the beginning of mastery. Write the moment. Complete the circuit. The garden awaits. The gardener who finally knows what they are planting.